going alphabetically. So I'm Christopher Bollen of the group. Thank you for having me, the Strand, and Brad, and being on this amazing panel. I guess we're just going to read a little bit and talk about our works, and then after we each read, go into more detail about our thoughts on the subject. I will say that Orient is the second novel. It's a crime novel. I suppose all gay novels are crime novels in some way. There, just to start off with, or until recently. But as my second novel, I wanted to make a novel that was had a gay character. Ooh. I think I turned off. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay. And part of Orient was using the word, and sexual orientation was a big part of it. I had been obsessed with crime since I was, crime books since I was a little kid, and it just seemed like for such a popular genre, it always allowed for a lot of voices of the other and weirdness and difference and, yes, gay characters in it. And it wasn't just the killers that were gay characters. It was often the questionable detectives. If you think of Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot or Nero Wolfe, they're all sort of ambiguously gay characters. But I wanted to make a character that was a 19-year-old and a gay kid. Who was sort of at the center of the crime, both maybe the detective and also the suspect and perhaps the killer. Anyway, just to set up this scene, this character came to New York, sort of an orphan from the West, and ran into some trouble in the city, and he meets an older man who lives in a place called Orient Point on the North Fork. I don't know if any of you have been out there. And he befriends this guy in the city, and this guy takes him out of the city to sort of save him and bring him to Orient to help fix up his house. It's a kind of, Paul is the older guy who takes Mills, who's the kid, out and kind of becomes his protector in a town where a series of crimes happen, and of course everyone instantly looks at the outsider. And sort of casts Mills as the potential killer or suspect. And then there's a scene earlier in the book where Mills sort of like comes out to Paul, and it's sort of this awkward inability to actually say it, a very awkward scene. And the scene I'm about to read is at the end of the book, where Mills feels much more comfortable, sort of makes a family with Paul in that way that gay men sort of build their own families away from their biological ones together, and sort of is trying to get Paul to come out because he's unsure after all this time whether Paul's actually gay or straight or just sort of is so repressed that he doesn't even know what he is. So briefly, I think my time's up, but thank you. No. I'll just speed read this to you. Okay, they're packing up the last of the houses. The end of the book, sort of, the killer is still not found, but they feel like maybe it's safe now. They're down in the cellar, moving the boxes. Paul dropped the boxes, dusting his hands. You ready to go back up? That drunk driving accident last summer, this always sounds so melodramatic because I'm cutting into it. That drunk driving accident last summer, Mills said gently. A giant shadow grew along the brick, which took him a second to recognize as his own. Paul's eyes receded behind their lenses. It wasn't an accident, was it? Paul yanked at his lip. He inflated his chest to try to keep his breathing even. Paul had never been willing to talk about himself. He had smoke-screened himself in kindness, taking on the role of father to refuse the far tougher negotiation of friendship. Only the mention of his brother seemed to shake him, but Patrick had been dead for 40 years, and Mills had no idea what shook Paul now. They could go on that way, knowing each other without risking anything deeper, but then Mills would always be a guest in this house. A family wasn't forged out of steel. You dig a hole in a person, and then you fill it with yourself. It's okay, Mills said. You can tell me. His voice rose. You can tell me. His voice rose into a question. I was drinking, Paul said, almost pleadingly, clinging to the official report. Drunk driving was favorable to vehicular suicide. I had too much and was exhausted. Please don't bring this up now. Mills thought of the bottle of Vicodin on Paul's bedroom bureau and the pain that had been embedded in him long before the crash. I saw Kara Norgan at Beth's house today. She said she witnessed the accident. She said she saw you drive into the tree. There wasn't a swerve. Paul turned halfway to the steps but stopped. It was uncomfortably quiet, an epilogue's dead page space. What do you want me to say, Paul whispered? That I've been unhappy? I think I've always been unhappy. That I was lonely? Yes, there's that too. I guess it hit me the day of the funeral, a parent that died, he's all by himself. Like hitting a tree. No, hitting a tree's easier because it brings you to a halt. His fingers reached for his mustache, that was gone too. Yes, I hit it. It was an accident, and for a long time the worst part was that I walked away. I survived it and came back home. Mills took a step forward. Paul drew his hand up either to apologize or to stop himself from coming closer. You still talk about a family, having kids, the hotel. That's not the point of kids, is it? To make you happy? I'm 47. I'm not going to have children. I'm not going to get married. I never was. Can we please not continue? But there must have been someone once. After nearly 2 months, Mills still didn't know if he should say a woman or a man. But wasn't there always a someone once for everyone? It seemed to Mills as inevitable as the flu that for each member of the human species would eventually bear the loss of a someone once. Mills might have been asking that for his own peace of mind. He wanted to believe that he wouldn't end up as lonely as Paul. A long time ago, there might have been a few, one or two I thought I loved. Paul folded his arms over his chest. One or two, gender neutral. Was Paul being vague because he was an expert closet case, or out of some misguided respect for Mills's orientation? But it didn't work out and the years added up. Look, the accidents, the car crash, whatever you want to call it, it was a moment of weakness, a deliberate moment of weakness. But I'm happier now. Paul's eyes begged Mills for affirmation, the way a patient begs a doctor for positive test results. I'm happier. I made a decision to live close to my parents and to care for them. That it might have prevented me from other things, but I don't regret it. I was all they had to depend on. Mills wondered if not becoming attached to anyone at all really was another sacrifice Paul had made for his parents. If they had treated Paul less like a slave and more like a son, he might have had a chance at happiness. Paul was an architect even in his hobbies, painting landscapes that never included a single human figure. To draw a person was to reduce a scene to scale, to ruin its eternal beauty by fixing it to a time and place. Dead landscape paintings filled the cellar, infinite and impotent in bloodless yellows and blues. A headache of sea and sky. One little dot and they might have taken on life. Paul had brought Mills to the house in Orient to be that dot, the smudge on the doorknobs, the dirty feet on the coffee table, the stain on the bathroom rug. Paul needed to come out not as gay or straight, but as human. It must seem like I don't have much, Paul said. Mills could have answered yes. Instead, he put his arms around him. He hugged him just as he had this clock, savagely, full-bodiedly, almost lifting him from the ground. Hey, Paul said, but he too was hugging, pressing his weight on him, the stench of their breaths mixing, the scratch of cheek stubble, the dry skin of radiator heat in winter. Two men of different ages, not father and son, not lovers, just the tight grappling hug of two people who found themselves in an underground room. All right, Paul said, but he was squeezing harder than Mills. It's time we went upstairs, as if time were of the essence, as if time were Paul's main problem. Mills let go. They climbed the steps, shut the bulkhead doors, and traveled in slow astronautical strides through the empty Benchley back rooms. These could be Mills' rooms too. And he was so fixated on the possibilities of what these rooms could contain that as he walked down the hallway toward the front of the house, Mills mistook the red strobe lights revolving through the windows as a string of Christmas lights, a festive early twinkle of things to come. But Paul froze in the hallway, recognizing their source. The police are in the driveway, he said. I want you to go upstairs. It's a little crime ending to that. Thank you.
I think I'm breaking the alphabetical order just slightly. I'm Garth Greenwell, and I'm going to read just a single paragraph from my book. My book has a 41-page paragraph, so that's not really too reassuring, but I'm not going to read that one. I want to say what an honor it is to get to read with four writers whose work I've admired so much for years. I feel rather starstruck. My book begins with the narrator, who's an American high school teacher working in Sofia, Bulgaria. It begins when he meets a younger Bulgarian man in a bathroom, a public bathroom beneath Sofia's National Palace of Culture, and he pays that man for sex. I'm going to read from the end of the first time that younger man, whose name is Mitko, comes to the narrator's apartment. And I think all you need to know is that Mitko has just spent hours on Skype using the narrator's internet to chat with his friends, and then also to make appointments with other clients. And the narrator, who has become increasingly exhausted and bored, has pulled off a book to read. And the book he pulls out to read is Cavafy. Some readers have complained that the book has no humor in it, but I think it's very funny that the narrator pulls out Cavafy at this moment. My fatigue was a kind of agitation now. I kept opening and closing the book I held unread on my lap. I couldn't find what I had found in it before, the recovery of something like nobility from the mawkishness of desire, the sense that stray meetings in dark rooms or the shadowy commerce of my own evening could burn with genuine luminosity, rubbing up against the realm of the ideal, ready at an instant to become metaphysics. I set the book aside, seeing that Mitko was tired too, tired and noticeably drunk. He had emptied nearly 2/3 of the bottle we had bought. He was unsteady on his feet when he stood up, having said goodbye to the man in Plovdiv and having announced his intention, finally, to sleep. There were 3 hours left until we would have to wake, he for his short trip to Plovdiv, a couple of hours on a comfortable bus, and I for a day of teaching, when I would stand before my class wearing a face scrubbed of the eagerness and servility and need it wore as I followed Mitko to the bathroom. Standing behind him, he was still naked as he stood to piss. I rubbed his chest and stomach, lean and taut, the skin of my hands catching just slightly on the bristles of hair, and then at his words of permission or encouragement, something like, "Go on, I don't mind," my hands went lower. And gingerly, I took the base of his cock and wrapped my hand around the shaft, feeling beneath my fingers the flow of water, heavy and urgent, and feeling too my own urgency, the hardness I pressed against him. He leaned his head back, pressing his face against mine, rubbing it. It too was stubbled and rough against the softness of my own, and I felt him harden as he finished pissing, as I carefully skinned him back and shook the last of it, feeling almost suffocated with longing, having never touched anyone in that way before, having never before been of that particular service. Mitko turned to me and kissed me, deeply and searchingly and possessingly, at the same time pushing me backward down the hallway toward the bedroom, pushing me and perhaps also using me for support to the broad bed where we had lain together earlier and where now we lay down again. He wrapped his arms around me and pulled me close to him. And not just his arms, he wrapped his legs around me too, and with all 4 of his limbs pressed me to him, embracing me so that when I breathed in, the air was filtered through him, smelling of alcohol, of course, but also of his own scent that elicited such an animal response from me, that so fired me up. I imagined the chambers of the brain lighting up, thrown switches in a house. He lay like some marine creature wrapped around me, wrapping around me again if I shifted or half woke, and I slept as I have seldom slept, deeply and almost without disturbance, held like his beloved or his child, or held, I suppose it must be said, like his captive or his prey. Thank you.
I mean, I feel a little responsible for this because the idea came up about giving a reading at the Strand and expanded to having a panel during this week. And I thought of my favorite books of the last year and mentioned each of these, and miraculously everybody said yes, which doesn't usually happen. So it's like a dream team. I'm going to read from the prologue of my memoir, Smash Cut, a memoir of Howard and art in the 70s and the 80s, about my complicated love affair with the filmmaker Howard Brookner between 1978 and 1989 when he died of AIDS. And in this part in the prologue, it sort of explains the title, how it applies to this idea of then and now. Although I was thinking if that title hadn't worked out, it could also be The Rime of the Ancient Mariner or A Tale of Two Cities. Since anyone, I think, of my generation walking through New York now is always sort of feeling in two very different places. Like when I went to Warby Parker to get my prescription glasses, and then I realized that the Mineshaft Club had been on, if not there, with like a door away. So that and other even more profound thoughts come up. From my apartment, I catch sight across 23rd Street of the top floor dormers and ivy-covered brick chimneys and steeple towers of the Chelsea Hotel. Sometimes through a bedroom window, sometimes a kitchen window, sometimes reflected in a bathroom door mirror, or sun-dappled in the late afternoon ricocheting off my office door. Howard and I lived at the Chelsea for 3 years. When I walked by each morning on my way to the gym, I always clock our 5th floor front room with French doors and balcony. I see the O in the hotel sign and remember it looming in black and white photographs of my 30th birthday party. The little guitar store was briefly a photocopy shop that we ran. Now, like a metaphor of demolition and expropriation, the hotel has been vacated, its walls stripped, wiring replaced, our old windows boarded up, the place being revamped as a serious luxury hotel rather than a bohemian folly. You can't get there from here, nor would I want to. I'm not nostalgic, just shocked. Shocked at the difference between then and now. It's not simply a pleasant reverie to think back on those times, no recollecting in tranquility. It's more like a smash cut, that editing option so favored by Howard and other film school students during the 70s, splicing one image or event up against another totally unrelated image or event. I'm looking out at Memory Hotel from the bedroom of the apartment in a co-op that I share with my husband, Paul. Husband, now that is a smash cut. When Howard and I were together in a complex fandango that included living together and living separately and being monogamous and pursuing three-ways or separate boyfriends, the option of two men having a legal marriage recognized under state law did not even remotely exist. We were boyfriends or lovers or friends with a capital F, but not husbands or even partners. No event horizon for such a life choice was at all visible. Paul and I have been together 11 years, married for 1. We have matching gold wedding bands that we bought together at Tiffany's. The 2 married gay guys downstairs have a baby girl they wheel up and down 24th Street in a stylish baby carriage. Sometimes Paul and I too talk about surrogates and egg donors and adoption and sperm count analysis. When I started writing down my memories, I was contemplating recording the fabulous times of my youth, the golden age of promiscuity, when I came to New York and everything was sex and poetry and la boheme for suburban American kids arriving to create their identities and do drugs and get laid. In a way, it was a response to the curiosity of young gay guys who often ask me some version of, "Oh, tell us what it was like in the 70s." Again, because this present for them seems so smashed up against that past. Well, I begin in a portentous tone. Back in the day, there were no cell phones. To make a call, you dropped a dime in the phone booth at the corner. No online hookup sites either, just bars. New clubs were always opening in abandoned warehouses or down a flight of steps into a cellar or up a freight elevator. No one seemed to have a job. Eventually I get around to telling more of the good stuff. Frank O'Hara was a big figure for me, for us. Lots of us read his poetry in small towns in America and came to Manhattan, as I did in 1971, to become poets like Frank O'Hara or painters, or anything to do with art and creativity and politics too. O'Hara once wrote of politics that the only truth is face to face. I discovered while trying to write this handheld narrative of those lost years that when the heady buzz subsided and the sun came up, as it did every morning in those decades too, I would picture Howard Bruckner's alert face. History is face to face too. There is no way for me to separate out the story of the fabulousness and horror of the years from 1978 to 1989, and a little before and a little after from Howard, my lover or my boyfriend or friend or whatever we were to each other. Writing down my own lyrics to that song that I can't get out of my head, I wind up coming back to Howard, as that era for me always meant coming home to Howard, whatever home meant for us. If I were forced to choose one trait that defined us and our generation in those times, I'd have to say that we were romantics. It was a romantic time. The history I'm left with turns out to be of Howard and Brad face to face with some very interesting, very lively action going on in the deep background.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy and honored to be here. I'm going to read just a scene from a memoir called The Narrow Door, which came out earlier this year. And the Denise referred to in this passage is the writer Denise Guess, who was my best friend for 26 years. No one is walking the halls of the bathhouse tonight. The floors are clean, the ceiling is clean, the sheets, towel, and pillowcases are clean, which should lift my spirit. But I can only think about Denise, with whom I've spent the better part of the day. She's in her last hours. It's early Friday night. Anyone who would be here is already off to Rehoboth Beach, Fire Island, New Hope, or Asbury Park, any of the gay weekend resorts within driving distance of Philadelphia. But I couldn't bear the intensity anymore. All those faces turned toward Denise, waiting for her to go. She wouldn't let go. My stare is vacant, deliberately vacant. I am performing it. I am perfecting it. Music thumps the speakers, music that's working too hard to express transformation and joy. That is okay. I'm too stunned to feel anyway. My mind is still inside that hospice room, the Joni songs, the nimbus of warmth and confusion surrounding that bed. Maybe that's why I'm here. I thought I'd wanted to touch someone. I thought I'd wanted to escape myself, but maybe I want just the opposite, a cool, dark space, tight walls, low ceiling, where I can be attuned to the sound of my breathing again. Denise would understand. She'd have asked me all about it, would want to know the details, eyes wide open and in awe. She'd have said, why couldn't I be a gay man? With mock exasperation. But she'd have meant it, too, without any of the self-delight or condescension of people who often say such things. A skinny young guy with burning eyes hurries down the hall. He backs up, stops at the door of my little room with an affable, devilish smile. He seems interested. I might be interested too, but he keeps on walking, not with the aura of rejection, but because it's better to keep moving than to stake your claims on any one person. I think it's incredible that such places stay open, what with Grindr or Scruff or any of the other smartphone apps. Why keep them open? There has to be some better reason than simply to extend the last hours of an old tradition, which barely exists anymore. Then another man, thicker, more muscular, appears at the door. My response is instantaneous, animal. My spine goes straighter. The other face is hard, squarish, a smart head shorn to the scalp, all bone and plain and brow. Salt and pepper whiskers, a salt and pepper pelt on chest and shoulders. In his eyes, certainty, solidity, gravitas. On the street, in a different neighborhood, he might be thought to be a construction worker who spends more time than usual shaping and trimming his beard. But in here, I know better. Skin against skin, salt and musk and heat of mouth, on chest, stomach, whose body is whose. I shouldn't be able to answer that. I should be so immersed in my skin that the remix on the sound system doesn't matter. The fact is that I do know where I begin and end. I'm looking at myself from myself. A stance is wanted from me, a male presence, a take-chargeness, though I can't find the part of myself that could give someone else those things, at least not now. All those faces looking at Denise, the thunderstorm outside, the candles and their cups inside. It's all over now, Baby Blue, playing in the room. I don't know why this song, of all songs, made me pause and well up when I first heard Joni's cover of it. At the time, I thought she was only singing about herself, the end of youth, the artist who was identified with blue. But it's not just that. All you seasick sailors, they are rowing home. And joy, well, whatever that is, joy feels elsewhere tonight, not in this city, not in this palace of empty rooms. The man sees questions on my face. Somehow he knows how to sit back and let me say, my friend is dying. He asks questions about my friend, and I tell him everything I'm able to tell. I'm careful not to use up his patience, as I know how easy it would be to do such a thing. He's a nurse, he says, and knows a thing or two about burying people he cares about. And it doesn't matter if we end up screwing each other senseless or not. Doesn't matter if the chemistry isn't right for tonight and I can't stay hard for him. Kindness has happened instead. He puts his arms around me from behind, then plants a dry kiss on the back of my neck. And piece by piece, he hands me back my clothes. Thanks a lot.
Late tonight, I'll think of what I should have said and telephone you all. It doesn't always start with the suitcase. Sometimes things begin with the wrong book. Berlin meant boys, Isherwood said. 50 years after his adventures among proletarian toughs, Berlin meant white boys who wanted to atone for Germany's crimes by loving a black boy like me. The first time I saw the Mercedes-Benz star revolving over Europa Center, West Berlin's triumphant commercial hub, I knew I was home. I had a room in a hotel near the main West Berlin station, the sort of place where burned-out hippies beat up their girlfriends. I didn't even turn on the light as I tossed in my bag. I hit the heavy-named streets, delight in my stride. You would have thought I'd arrived in Venice, but I'd read quite a bit about how the not old for Europe structures of West Berlin, stripped of decoration, felt squeezed by the post-war functionalism of the here to replace what was unremembered. I pranced to the central shopping mall. West Berlin was the outpost of Western prosperity, the floating island of neon and pleasure deep inside communist territory. This was its core. I'd read that after the construction of the Berlin Wall, both sides wanted to distract their populations from the border cutting through the heart of the capital. Each side created its own new city center away from the wall. East Berlin had Alexanderplatz, dominated by the giant needle and revolving restaurant of a television tower visible for miles. West Berlin had Europa Center, a wall of steel and glass, or courtyard of shops and offices nestled beside an office tower, the only one of its kind in the city when erected in 1961. It blocked out psychologically the wall of mortar and wire that ran parallel along the same north-south axis, dividing east from west. The standing rectangle of tower looked across the Tiergarten, a vast park that had become as quiet as no man's land because of its proximity to the wall. At any hour, the Tiergarten was filled with boys, silently cruising under the cover of post-war linden or chestnut trees. The tower block was grounded in a narrow plaza. The past sat on the shoulder of everything you saw in Berlin. The ruin of a Romanesque revival spire marked one end of the plaza, chiding the ugly modern octagon of beehive blue glass next to it that was built as the new church, and also as a memorial to the old one. Had there been traffic, it would have flowed around this plaza. There the Kurfürstendamm begins, West Berlin's show street that makes a humorless diagonal through the city along the route Prussian kings took to their hunting lodges. In the middle of the plaza, a round fountain of big beige granite dollops is still running. My very first night in Berlin, the people hanging out around the fountain, young or just long-haired, looked like they'd met at the train station a few minutes before and had walked over to conclude unsavory transactions. Young couples, families of shoppers, and groups of moviegoers kept their distance, sitting under umbrellas at the beer, cola, and coffee tables at the other end of the plaza. The company emblem turned in the friendly sky. Behind the red Mercedes-Benz star, perfectly in line with it as I looped back around, was a pink August sun just beginning to quit. This was the start of the awful 1980s. I saved money from my second job, a telephone marketing gig, for the few weeks I could afford to spend in Berlin every summer. Just before Chicago flipped out because of AIDS terror, I was getting away, but every summer coming back too soon, broke and heartbroken over some kerchief bartender and feeling superior to everything about my hometown. I was leaving pieces of myself in Berlin, like a bird carrying its feathers one by one to a distant nest. In the Cold War days, Berlin was far away, a disco ball behind the Iron Curtain. I smoked menthols on bar stools, snorted lines in paperless stalls, and threw up on corners all over the near North Side, protected by my dream of eventual escape. Though born in Chicago, I was just passing through. Whatever had happened at the Golden Rectangle, whatever was going down on the South Side did not matter. I may have fallen apart in the city of my birth, but the city of my rebirth would see me put back together again. My real life of the happiness I deserved would begin once I got over there and stayed. What had not happened in Chicago would finally happen in Berlin, the city that owed me and loved my fantasies. I was idiotic during my first visit to Berlin. I bought drinks 3 nights running for a sour-smelling old man who told me he had inherited from his father the most rare footage in Europe, 27 seconds of Nijinsky dancing. Of course, the film was held in a bank. He'd invite me special to see it. It used to be Aimez-vous Paris that the black G I ran to, my dad said, rolling slowly in his chair, up to and back from the desk. But you and your cousin can't get enough of that Sprechen Sie jive. I didn't tell him that because I'd been in a bar all day, I'd snored through the Berlin Philharmonic concert that my cousin had taken me to. I forgave before anyone else did, the young, blind prowler I had been, who drank as though Weimar culture could be got through the bottle. After those few summers of desperate rehearsal, tourist make-believe, I was recently sober and alone in a train compartment about to be locked tight for the border crossing between the fast-driving, exhibitionist German Federal Republic and the paranoid German Democratic Republic with its harsh fuels. I'd left Chicago behind for good. I was inordinately proud of my one-way ticket. I'd become that person I so admired, the Black American expatriate. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I want to give you a moment. If you have any responses to each other's work, I'd love for you to add that, but if not, we can jump right into questions.
I just had one question for everyone and myself. I was thinking yesterday in Gay Pride, I remember around 1981 being in Gay Pride March, and there was a writers contingent, and there was Edmund White, Dennis Cooper, I was there, and that's, a dozen people. And then we had these placards of Whitman and Rimbaud and Proust. Then when we got to the New York Public Library, we ran up the steps and then ran back down with our little posters, and we're very proud of ourselves. But I was just wondering, and somehow it said something about our feeling that we were somehow occupying literature by writing these gay works. And I was just wondering how the rest of you feel about how we feel about that now.
Sorry. It reminds me of that poster when I was in college of all the gay writers. which always meant so much to me. I think that's amazing that we didn't do that when I was growing up in Cincinnati, but Ed's from Cincinnati, so but no one told me that when I was at St. Xavier High School for boys. It's funny, you have to find these things out on your own. So for me, literature was always that thing of like discovering on your own the great gay writers because no one was teaching them to me. Mm-hmm. So that kind of follows that logic.
That was the great thing about coming to school in New York, because you were taught in places where queer life was invisible everywhere else. It was very visible in literature, and you cared very much about your literary pedigree as a homosexual, as we used to say. So, you know, it was an initiation into a very elite club. So you were talking about Shakespeare and Marlowe and Rimbaud and Verlaine and Auden and Isherwood and Baldwin and Gorvidal and Frank O'Hara, and we're very much at the center of these things. Bloomsbury was a romantic and gay movement. The Harlem Renaissance was a romantic and gay movement. The New York School, the Beats, even the romantics of 1816 were rather that way. So you came to New York to kind of find yourself, but to find not people like you. Because in those days you learned as much from your peers as you did from your professors. So you came to become something different.
I'm thinking about the fact that the first gay writers I read, Jane Bowles, Melville, Henry James, Virginia Woolf, all of these people whose work I immediately connected with were not identified as gay or queer in my graduate school English program. And this was back in the 80s. I immediately felt at home in that work, but it seems just entirely fascinating that, however many years later that is, that context was never discussed in relationship to the work.
Really? Because it was never not part of the discussion among, I don't know, other writers. But it was a gay professor who rediscovered Henry James, Mathewson, and a gay professor who rediscovered Melville.
Right.
And they all sort of paid the price for it.
Well, at that time, my professors just disciplined that off the stage. It just like bullied it out of the discussion, and made for a really clean, kind of empty discussion. It's crazy.
Well, I was in public school in Kentucky. And, there was certainly, I grew up believing, I've never fact-checked this, but I grew up believing that it was actually illegal for my teachers to say the word gay in the classroom. That was what we believed, and certainly they never did. But there was a great bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky called Holly Cook, and they had a lesbian and gay section, which I now live in a town with a great bookstore, Prairie Lights in Iowa City. They also have a gay and literature section. And I have complicated feelings about that gay and lesbian literature section. For the first few months I lived in Iowa City, I was amazed that Prairie Lights didn't have any Colum Toybeen, because it was sort of back in this corner in the gay and lesbian. So I have complicated feelings now, but it was a lifesaver when I was a kid. Because I was 13 or 14 and, not being the popular sort, on weekend evenings I went to this bookstore, and I could sort of hide in that corner, and it felt like a place where it was okay to be in that corner. And I knew that anything I pulled off the shelf would somehow, that it had something to say to me. And because I was in public high school in Kentucky, I was not getting a literary education, which in one way was kind of wonderful because, everything was equally meaningless. But it meant that, I would pull Mishima off the shelf, or I would pull James Baldwin off the shelf, or I would pull Cavafy off the shelf. And I had the experience of feeling like they were speaking to me with a kind of intimacy, that in some way they were kind of whispering to me the secret of myself. And I do think that one of the things that makes queer art so vibrant and so often on kind of the forefront of, you know, what's exciting and what's new in art is the way in which queerness is a kind of free radical. I mean, there's a way in which queerness can, you know, crosses those boundaries by which we usually organize our lives, so that, you know, if I had had a good literary education, I almost certainly would have been schooled in the way that I was later schooled in American literature, in British literature, in poetry, in fiction. But when I was 13 in Holly Cook, I was just pulling books off the shelf. And there was a way in which, I mean, that seems to me very valuable. It seems to me very valuable that as a kid who had no idea who Mishima was, I could read Confessions of a Mask and feel like it was a book about me. And even though that idea that it's a book about me has been, you know, radically complicated in the years since, I also think it's still true.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like when you're, I mean, we all know this who grew up in, like, you know, Kentucky's right next to Ohio. So it's just like when you're young, you're just, and gay, you're so obsessed with finding these hints of a mirror of you anywhere. And you so often find it in books or movies. I don't even want to know the list of Blockbuster rentals when I was 13, because it must be deeply embarrassing and very homosexual. But it reminded me of, like, there's a scene in your book about the narrator going into the bathrooms and, like, sort of cruising zones. And I was thinking while reading your book about how, for some reason, when I was 13, bathrooms, gym locker rooms, but also bookstores were deeply erotic places. And not just because of those Tom Bianchi calendars that were, although that helped.
Although that did, yeah, that's part of it. Yeah.
But yeah, there were just these one of the few zones allotted to a kid or to a young, you know, teen to find those traces, and how important those shelves were. Even though, yeah, we hate to be, like, ghettoed into the gay and lesbian section, I loved those sections as a kid. It was like a dangerous but exciting. It's like New York, you know, in miniature in Cincinnati.
You know, I love being in that section in Three Lives, though. You know, when I go into Three Lives, that great bookstore, because their gay and lesbian section, it's like the section. You know, it's like the stars. Whereas in Prairie Lights, it is kind of tucked away in a sort of, I'm going to talk to them about it, you know, because it's really not okay how they have it. But it's true. I mean, it is this weird thing. I don't know how to negotiate it. Because, of course, I mean, the whole idea of ghetto, you know, which gay writers are still being told this. There's a writer who's coming to Iowa next year who just did undergraduate at Columbia. And his professors there told him, if you write a book about gay people, you'll be in a gay ghetto. And you won't have a readership. I mean, that's shocking to me. It's shocking to me that we can think about a gay ghetto when all of these names, this is the heart of the canon. You know, it's where you want to be.
Literature, yeah.
No question.
There, you know, you write for the future and for the ideal reader. Publishing is a business that functions by precedent, so it does things to death until they don't work. A lot of the identity, blah, 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 blah. I mean, you know, you try to turn everything to an advantage or to work with it. I never minded the gay section because it meant that I was part of a secret society, but it also represented a very safe space right in front of you, physically and psychologically. I can remember intense discussions when people would say, you should want to be a writer who happens to be black and not accept people calling you a black writer. And this is such a losing game, you know, because you don't write to kind of people please. I think that the interesting moment is that this secret society, it's very hard for someone my age to give up the very refreshing snobbery of it. You know, the democracy of inclusiveness and equality is is great, but you do lose something when it goes mainstream, and it's hard to put into words what that is. And people have that anxiety about it. Black friends, now that we've had Obama every day for years, and we are really going to miss him. It's impossible to criminalize the image of the black again. So you go into the mainstream, but you feel as a culture you're giving up something of that secret society, that edge, that being marginal, that purity of being on the outside. The mainstream comes at a very high price.
It also worked. I mean, talking about politics, in the 70s, when if you wrote gay literature, you could only be pretty much published by these kind of small gay presses. But there was also like different light bookstore, and there was one in seemingly every major city. And so you'd publish this little book that had 500 copies and go on a 12-city book tour or something. So there was a kind of underground. So there's an underground railroad to it. Right. And it felt, that's why I brought that up in a way, it felt political, just as we were in the march. There's no writers contingent that I know of in the gay march now, and even though none of those people I mentioned, including me, thought were overtly activist in their politics, I think just by writing gay stories and poems, or Robert Mapplethorpe taking those pictures, it was actually a kind of political act at the time. So
and
it had a power.
One thing fed another, all of the arts.
Right.
Because you have the same feeling in the world of dance or classical music or jazz or pop or that struggling against the closet, so to speak, and speaking in codes and then teaching them to everyone else, and then surviving.
Do we have questions from the audience for any of these gentlemen? Yes.
Yes, so in the 70s and 80s, there was Oscar Wilde. And in fact, that was a wonderful book.
That was a great bookstore,
Yeah, and we were at Wars. My best friend worked at Oscar Wilde. And then when you talked about the march in the 70s and 80s, there was the Lesbian History Archives. Right. I don't know if you remember, but they marched, and I with them, with their placards of these wonderful women, lesbian writers from a long time ago up to the present time. And they're out in Brooklyn now, actually.
But lest we turn it into the Garden of Eden, I have a Oscar Wilde bookstore story, which is I put out my first book, Jailbait and Other Stories, and it was banned at the Oscar Wilde bookstore because it had included straight sex. And then they sold it, so then they agreed to sell it, but sort of under the counter. So,
You were with the good stuff.
It's interesting also, the books back then that taught sort of gay history or queer history, these popular things like A.L. Ross that we slightly look down on now because the scholarship and the history has made such a sort of advances that one work by a gay writer doesn't have to do everything it used to. It can now just be this or be that, but the whole thing of always somehow advancing the cause or not is completely absent from the discussion of these books now. And that I remember as a big part of this gay sort of fiction thing, and I only published fiction in places I was sure my parents did not have a subscription.
I have a question, because I was trying to think of if I, as a gay writer, have like a gay sensibility, and certainly I can say that if I were not gay, I doubt I would have been a writer. I doubt I would have gone to New York even, there's a lot of choices that I think are attached to that identity. But do you guys think that there's anything called a gay sensibility in writing, or are there qualities to gay fiction that you kind of compare them across the board, or is it? I don't know the answer to this. I'm asking.
I think it feels really important to me to identify within a queer tradition, and there are elements of my work that feel to me as though they are drawn from that tradition. But I don't think that the queer tradition has ever been singular, and I don't think, one is born into it. I think like any kind of tradition, I think a tradition is just a conversation between writers over time. And I think any tradition is a question of elective affinity. And I think there are many queer traditions, and I think probably any writer who wants to identify within that tradition would think about that identification in certain ways. But to me, I mean, there is a relationship to language, a relationship to the sentence that to me draws deeply from a tradition of writing that feels to me like queer writers talking to each other over time.
I think you can see writers in the past trying to use the form of the genre or what was possible for them at that time to accommodate what they had to say. I mean, Isherwood put it on the women characters to reject the first-person narrator so he doesn't have to pretend he's straight. You know, he just kind of left it out, this sort of not going through the motions. And something like Giovanni's Room is this 50s poor boyer, but you can feel Baldwin's lyricism about male love struggling through the confines of this sort of genre. And then the Beats and the New York School and stuff like that, those movements seem designed to express what couldn't be expressed in more conventional sort of means. So for me, it's always, if there's a queer tradition, it's an experimental one and a challenging one. And also because we tend to look at the masterpieces. Masterpiece is something that changes what comes after, but you can't imitate it. So the queer tradition was always something of singular moments that couldn't be repeated, but somehow had to be absorbed. Does that make sense?
But one other thing that I wanted part D of that is also time. So that, the time in history. So I was thinking about the other day, Giovanni's Room and Gore Vidal and City and the Pillar, and you have these kind of gay, straight, kind of almost arch relationships, but very interesting. And then it was almost, then you went to a period of everything was a boy's own story, whereas all the gay love was open. And now you can write about then straight gay, or like you're a hustler gay, these kinds of things. And it's the same as what Vidal and Baldwin were doing, but different because we're in a different
You don't have to
time.
kill them anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, you had to kill the gay guy at the campfire.
But Darryl, I mean, I would say that there is pressure put on these books to bear a kind of burden of representation. Or at least it's felt that way to me in many of the conversations that I've had, as I've been reading and traveling in support of this book, that there has been, from some readers, there has been a lot of frustration and even a kind of anger that has a heat I don't entirely understand. Because they charge, gay books shouldn't be like this anymore. Gay books should not be about sex in bathrooms. Gay books should not be about sex work. Gay books should be about, and family values. And, and obviously, and a kind of, and that gay books should subscribe to and further that kind of, narrative of triumph that is, the story that our culture likes to tell about LGBT people and their rights.
I was thinking about that in relation to all the things. I'm thinking about the oppression that you're suggesting. I'm thinking about that against all the things that have not been explored yet about gay life, like the complexities of open relationships. I was making a long list on my train ride up here, and I could pull it out if you want me to, but it's so much of gay life to me still seems to be a wilderness. I mean, what about, the complexities of intimacy? Like, how has the prospect of HIV really mucked up with our intimacy? What is it like to have sex in an era in which some people use condoms and some people are taking PrEP? It's so complex to me, but I've seen none of this, yet on the page. So
It used to be that the gay literature about the scene was by definition also kind of déclassé literature. Right. But then once acceptance and respectability comes along, you cross back to this class line of middle-class America and sort of white families and things like that, that actually I don't find terribly interesting myself.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the things that's not talked about in gay literature is the class line in America itself and gay life, really. But it's because Bohemia is a classless space, as is youth. But now that everyone's living longer and these voices age, there's room for everything. So your list will turn into the next book about whatever. You wouldn't believe how much.
Finish that later. That sounds good.
Do you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to make an observation about each of the passages that you read were incredibly touching and intimate, and showed a kind of surprising intimacy in surprising places, for instance, and surprising coupling. And I guess that seems to me like to be very. It felt very like a serendipitous sort of celebration of a surprising intimacy, which seems very queer to me.
Well, that's something, I mean, I've gotten to do several readings with Paul in the last several months, and I've heard him read that passage before, and I love that passage because I think, it explores places like bathhouses. I mean, explores these cruising places in a way that is open to their complexity. And I feel like that sort of triumphant narrative that wants all gay people to live behind picket fences has to, in order to sort of justify itself, has to deny the complexity of those places. And I think it's really important that, or when writing about sex work, to acknowledge that these are human situations and therefore they are sort of infinitely rich and complex situations. And that's a way in which, I mean, to me, writing real literature is about recognizing the wilderness all around us at all times, and I mean the fact that when we look hard enough to see through the narratives that we're told about our lives or that we're urged to tell about our lives, that I mean really we are all always in a wilderness, which is I think kind of the only legitimate reason to write or to write imaginatively.
Also, all fiction in a way becomes, good fiction becomes history. So you think about when Isherwood took up with Don Picardi, there weren't really very many models how men should live together. One of the things I find so touching about Smash Cut is that you see these two young men making up the rules for themselves about a relationship that hasn't really been prepared for in their experience. So,
which is also Giovanni's room.
That too. And Howard Brookner was a very special person. It's good to remember.
Yes.
Well, I'm reminded by these recent comments that one of the most influential pieces of gay writing was written by a straight woman. And I wonder whether any of you felt moved or influenced in any way by the kind of phenomenon of Brokeback Mountain.
No. That's not true.
I thought you were going to say Hanya Yanagihara, and I was really excited.
Brokeback Mountain. It's a
I like that
great
story.
Yeah.
I'm teaching it. I'm teaching it this summer, not in the context of queer literature, but in the context of literature of place.
It's a great story. The film is not going anywhere, and there's an opera. It will sort of go on and on.
The opera. The opera. I mean, yeah. It was not a great opera, I don't think. I know you.
But that is interesting that you both brought up two straight women writers who wrote successful gay fiction, and probably more successful than we can think of any recent gay writer writing
Do you
gay
think of
fiction.
Annie Poole as all that straight? Really?
I don't actually know her personally well enough. You maybe do. I don't know.
I don't know. You don't know?
When a straight person writes about gay relationships, can you tell that there's a lack of authenticity to it, or do you find that you're able to clue in quicker if you're reading somebody that is actually gay writing about?
I just think it depends on how good the writer is. I mean, I think people have really strong feelings about Hanya's book. I've written about the fact that I think it's a really brilliant exploration of gay male lives and gay male subjectivity. I think maybe the most beautiful literary representation of a gay relationship I know is in Iris Murdoch's A Fairly Honorable Defeat, in which what is pretty recognizably a gay marriage, even though the book is from 1969, what's recognizably a gay marriage is kind of the still point that survives the destruction of a whole social world. I mean, to me, I believe very strong. I mean, I feel like we are getting to a place as a culture where we have begun to all but deny the possibility of writing across difference. I just feel like there are too many books that do that brilliantly. And in terms of gay male experience, I think there's something very dangerous in thinking that identity is authority. And I think that it's kind of, it's perilously essentializing to sort of say, to talk about an authentic gay experience. Because I don't think there's such a thing. I think if a book is written well, it's going to be convincing.
I believe that a writer is free to do anything, yes. But then historically, it took so much for the black voice to be heard,
Yes.
rather than to be represented by others. And the same is sort of true of the queer voice. It took a lot to kind of be sort of itself. So it has sort of a place. It's just these days we must live with contradictions. We must be able to hold two ideas, conflicting ideas at the same time. That the authentic does matter. That the freedom of the writer or the artist to pick any subject does matter as well. And somehow you negotiate what there is. But I think the cost of becoming can't be forgotten.
Also, I wonder if, did women reading A Room with a View feel like it wasn't as good of a love story because of gay? I mean, they didn't know that Forster was gay at the time, but I mean, gay people have been writing so much heterosexual narrative so successfully for so long.
Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Mary Renault, Persian boy. Hanya's the new Mary Renault or something.
Your Sonar, yeah.
Yeah, first person guy, gay guy.
I think it's, I think it's always a dangerous undertaking to write across difference. I also think it's always it's a valuable one, and I think it depends on, a kind of emotional risk that, and I think especially if you're writing from a position of privilege, across difference into a position that has been sort of structurally deprivileged, I think one should feel that that's a risk, and that it has to be approached in a way that, puts the self of the writer at risk in some way. I think about James Baldwin in this way, in the way that he wrote about, it requires, in some way, an ability that I think is really hard, or a willingness to sort of confront myths that we all subscribe to. I don't know, I think it's hard, but I think Hanya Yanagihara did it. I think that's a really brilliant book, and it does not feel to me like, and again, I know many people feel differently, but that felt to me as authentic as any representation of gay male subjectivity I've read.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. If not, that's okay too. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.